car died on a Tuesday afternoon in August, on a long stretch of Highway 26 just west of Portland, Oregon, where the road opens wide and the sky starts to feel almost too large for a person carrying ordinary worries. Rachel Calloway had been driving back from her sister Ellen's house in Beaverton when the engine light flickered once. Then again, before the steering wheel suddenly went heavy beneath her hands. The Subaru drifted toward the shoulder slowly, almost gently, as though the vehicle itself had already decided there was no point continuing. She coasted to a stop beside a barrier lined with dry grass and gravel, and sat there in the sudden silence, listening to the ticking sound of the cooling engine while traffic rushed past in bursts. At first, she did what many wives does when something inconvenient happens in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day. She reached for her phone and called her husband. Nathan Calloway had answered every call Rachel had made to him for 17 years. Not most calls. Not urgent calls. Every call. That kind of consistency changes the architecture of a person's nervous system over time. It teaches you safety through repetition. It teaches you that someone exists in the world who can be reached. The phone rang. Voicemail. Rachel frowned slightly and called again. Voicemail. By the fourth attempt, something unfamiliar had started moving quietly through her chest. Not panic. Nathan worked on infrastructure projects all over Oregon and Washington. Dead zones happened. Site inspections happened. Long stretches without signal happened. Still, 11 unanswered calls in 12 minutes sat differently inside her than they should have. A man in a dusty pickup eventually pulled over behind her and offered help while she waited for a tow truck. He was friendly in the casual Pacific Northwest way that never feels intrusive. He asked where she was headed, asked if she was all right, mentioned a neighborhood in Hillsboro while making conversation about traffic patterns west of Portland. Rachel barely registered most of what he said, but one thing stayed. A street name. Just a street. Nothing more. At the time, it meant absolutely nothing. And yet, the human mind has a strange relationship with danger. Sometimes it notices something long before it understands why the thing matters. Rachel thanked the driver when the tow truck arrived. She climbed into the cab beside the mechanic and looked out the passenger window while Portland disappeared behind them in layers of gray-blue distance and fading summer light. Nathan finally called back at 8:47 that evening. Dead zone in the Cascades, he explained. Survey work. Bad signal. He sounded tired. Calm. Completely normal. He asked about the car immediately. Asked if she was all right. Asked if Ellen had room for her to stay the night. He said everything a good husband would say. Rachel believed him. Why wouldn't she? 17 years of marriage had trained her to trust the tone of his voice more than the uneasy instinct sitting quietly beneath her ribs. She went to sleep that night in Ellen's guest room believing she had experienced nothing more than an inconvenient breakdown on a highway outside Portland. What she did not know was that the 11 unanswered calls were the first visible fracture in a structure Nathan Calloway had spent nearly 2 decades building. And once a crack appears in something held together by pressure and precision, collapse becomes a matter of time. Because within 6 weeks, Rachel Calloway would sit 3 houses down from a quiet craftsman home in Hillsboro, Oregon, watching her husband mow a lawn she had never seen before. And beside that lawn would be children she did not know existed. Before we go any further, if you are invested in how this psychological chess match unfolds, hit subscribe. This story does not go where most people expect it to. There are 3 questions worth holding onto as this unfolds. The first is practical. How does a man maintain 2 complete lives for 17 years without making a single catastrophic mistake? Not an affair. Not occasional cheating. 2 full realities. 2 homes. 2 women. 2 entirely different versions of himself moving through the same state separated by only 40 minutes of highway. The second question is more uncomfortable. What does it actually require psychologically to sit across from one woman at dinner knowing another woman is setting a table for you in another city? What kind of compartmentalization allows a person to divide affection, routine, responsibility, memory, and presence with that level of precision for almost 2 decades? Most lies collapse because maintaining them becomes exhausting. Nathan Calloway somehow turned deception into infrastructure. And the third question matters most. What happens when the person who discovers the truth is not impulsive? What happens when the betrayed person is patient, measured, quiet, observant? Because Rachel Calloway did not scream when she found out. She did not throw dishes. She did not confront Nathan immediately. She did something far more dangerous. She started collecting information. And once she understood the full shape of what had been done to her, she stopped protecting the man responsible for it. That distinction matters. Rachel never destroyed Nathan's life. Nathan built a structure that depended entirely on secrecy. Rachel simply removed the secrecy. Everything else collapsed under its own weight. But to understand how a man reaches a point where he is maintaining 2 households across the Portland metropolitan area for 17 years, you have to go back to the beginning. Back before there were hidden bank accounts. Before separate phones. Before carefully calibrated weekends and synchronized lies. Back to 2003. Back to Portland when the city still felt smaller and slower and less expensive than it would become. Back to a dinner party in the Hawthorne district where Rachel Greene first met a civil engineer named Nathan Calloway. At the time, she believed she was meeting the man she would spend the rest of her life with. In some ways, she just didn't yet understand how many versions of that life existed. Rachel Greene grew up in Eugene, Oregon, the middle daughter of 3 girls raised in a household where reliability mattered more than spectacle. Her father taught high school history for 32 years. Her mother handled accounting for a lumber company outside Springfield. Money was never abundant, but stability existed in the house in ways Rachel would later understand many families never experience. Dinner happened at the same time every evening. Bills were paid carefully. Promises were kept. Nobody raised their voice unless something truly serious had happened. The atmosphere of Rachel's childhood taught her to trust consistency. It also taught her to notice details. She became the kind of child who remembered conversations almost word for word. The kind who noticed when a teacher changed tone halfway through a sentence or when one parent looked unusually tired during dinner. Observation simply felt natural to her. By the time she moved to Portland in the late 1990s, she had developed the quiet self-sufficiency of someone comfortable existing inside her own thoughts. She read constantly. History, fiction, essays, biographies. She liked information because information made the world feel understandable. In 2001, she became a librarian at Franklin High School in Southeast Portland, and she was extraordinarily good at it. Not because she cared more about books than other librarians did, but because she understood something essential about teenagers. Most of them were not searching for information. They were searching for somewhere to exist without performance. Rachel created that space almost instinctively. Students drifted into the library during lunch periods and after school because it felt calm there. Predictable. Safe. She was 31 years old when she met Nathan Calloway at a dinner party in Portland's Hawthorne district in November of 2003. It had been raining steadily all evening. The particular soft Oregon rain that makes city lights glow against wet pavement and turns ordinary neighborhoods into something almost cinematic. Nathan arrived late from a project meeting near Tillamook. Rachel noticed him before they spoke. Not because he was loud. The opposite. Nathan moved through rooms with a kind of restrained competence that naturally drew attention. He listened fully when people spoke. He answered questions carefully. He carried himself like a man accustomed to solving problems with real-world consequences. At one point during the evening, Rachel stood near the kitchen doorway listening to Nathan explain load distribution problems on a bridge repair project. What struck her wasn't the engineering. It was that Nathan genuinely found his work interesting. That mattered enormously to Rachel. She had always believed enthusiasm revealed character. People who cared deeply about what they did usually cared deeply about other things too. They spent nearly 3 hours speaking that night. About books. About Portland. About infrastructure. About why cities feel emotionally different depending on how they're designed. Rachel left the party with the strange calm certainty that she had met someone unusually solid. Nathan called 2 days later. By spring, they were inseparable. The relationship felt easy in the specific way rare compatibility often does. And when Nathan cried during their wedding ceremony in June of 2005 at a vineyard in the Willamette Valley, Rachel experienced something close to complete certainty. She believed she had chosen correctly. The painful truth is that she had. Nathan genuinely loved her. That was part of what made everything that followed so difficult to understand. Nathan Calloway did not look like a man capable of sustaining 2 separate realities. Most people imagine deception announcing itself somehow. Cruel men, manipulative men, reckless men. But Nathan's defining quality was steadiness. He showed up when he said he would. Paid bills on time. Remembered birthdays. Listened carefully. He was, by almost every external metric, exactly the kind of husband Rachel believed him to be. Which is what made the architecture of his second life so difficult to detect. It started in 2006. Nathan's engineering work increasingly pulled him west into Washington County as suburban expansion accelerated around Beaverton and Hillsborough. Infrastructure contracts multiplied throughout the mid-2000s. Roads, drainage systems, public works assessments. The travel requirements were legitimate. The overnight stays were legitimate. The inconsistent schedules were legitimate. Inside those legitimate movements, another life slowly began forming. Nathan met Diane Mercer during a subcontracting consultation connected to a municipal drainage project in Hillsborough. Diane was practical, warm, and emotionally direct. She worked as an administrative director for a small engineering consultancy, managing project logistics and personalities. Nathan told her early that he had come out of a long-term relationship and wasn't eager to rush into anything serious. That statement became the foundational lie supporting everything afterward, because it contained just enough emotional truth to feel believable. Nathan genuinely behaved like a man cautious about commitment. What Diane did not know was that the commitment already existed. 40 minutes east. In a craftsman house in southeast Portland where Rachel believed she was building a future with a husband who loved her completely. Diane trusted Nathan because Nathan behaved like someone trustworthy. The most effective deception rarely depends on constant manipulation. It depends on consistency. Nathan gave Diane reliability, presence, and attention. By 2008, their relationship had become serious. And by 2009, Diane was pregnant. And Nathan faced a decision most people assume would force reality into the open. Instead, he expanded the lie. He purchased a 3-bedroom craftsman home in Orenco Station under shared ownership with Diane, and quietly constructed a second domestic life with the same care he brought to engineering projects. He attended prenatal appointments, prepared a nursery, held Chloe Mercer Calloway in his arms the day she was born. And then, 40 minutes away in Portland, he continued being Rachel's husband. Neither woman knew the other existed. And somehow, impossibly, Nathan maintained that separation not for months or for years, but for 17 consecutive years. To understand how Nathan Calloway sustained 2 complete lives for 17 years, it helps to understand the geography of Portland. Because geography became part of the deception. Hillsborough sits west of Portland beyond the long gradual pull of Highway 26. In light traffic, the drive from Richmond to Orenco Station takes roughly 40 minutes. Long enough to feel separate. Short enough to remain logistically manageable for someone disciplined enough to organize his life around compartmentalization. Nathan's Portland life operated primarily Tuesday through Friday. His Hillsborough life occupied weekends and Mondays. The explanation for those movements already existed naturally inside his career. Site assessments, municipal travel, overnight inspections. Work that genuinely required irregular schedules. The most durable lies do not invent entirely new realities. They hide inside realities that already make sense. Rachel had spent years adapting herself to Nathan's work rhythm. She accepted canceled dinners occasionally, delayed phone calls, sudden trips. Not because she lacked awareness, but because she trusted him. And trust changes the way the mind processes inconsistencies. A suspicious person sees gaps. A trusting person fills those gaps automatically with reasonable explanations. Nathan understood this intuitively. Over time, he refined the systems supporting his parallel lives until many of them became almost involuntary. Separate phones. Separate credit cards. Separate banking patterns. He memorized schedules with the precision of an engineer calculating load tolerances. He knew where risks existed, where overlap might occur, which holidays required careful sequencing. For 17 years, he maintained emotional continuity between 2 households. In Portland, Rachel believed she had married a thoughtful, dependable engineer whose demanding career occasionally took him away from home. In Hillsborough, Diane believed she had built a life with a complicated but devoted partner hesitant about formal commitment because of emotional baggage from an earlier relationship. Nathan gave both women enough honesty to make the larger deception feel impossible. He was not pretending constantly. He genuinely cared about both households. He attended school events in Hillsborough, remembered anniversaries in Portland, helped Chloe with homework, cooked dinner with Rachel on quiet Thursday evenings. He existed fully inside both worlds. And because he existed fully inside them, neither woman had reason to believe she was receiving only half of him. Neighbors in Orenco station described Nathan as devoted. Friends in Portland described Nathan the same way. The contradiction only becomes visible from outside the structure. From inside it, everything appeared stable. But sustaining two realities for 17 years creates strain eventually. The strain came from maintenance, the endless management required to prevent accidental collision. A forgotten receipt, a mistimed phone call, a child mentioning a location, a holiday overlap, a dead car on Highway 26. Small things. Structural pressure rarely announces itself dramatically at first. It accumulates silently until eventually one tiny failure exposes everything underneath. And in August of 2021, pressure finally began gathering in places Nathan was no longer watching carefully enough. Nathan called Rachel back at 8:47 the evening her car broke down. Dead zone in the Cascades. Poor reception. Long day. His explanation arrived smoothly, fully formed, with the calm specificity of someone accustomed to being believed. Rachel accepted it. Not because she was naive, but because trusting Nathan had become one of the foundational habits of her adult life. Still, something small had shifted. 3 days later, Rachel stood in a grocery store parking lot balancing reusable bags against her hip when the street name from the highway floated unexpectedly back into her mind. Not the whole conversation, just the street. She had heard it before. She became certain of that immediately. But from where? Nathan had mentioned it years earlier in passing while discussing a project west of Portland. Rachel could almost hear the conversation without fully locating it. The memory sat just beyond reach. She drove home unsettled in a way difficult to explain logically. Nothing concrete existed. No evidence. No accusation. Only the strange sensation that something familiar had become slightly unfamiliar overnight. Rachel slept poorly that week. Her mind simply refused to settle. At 4 a.m. on Friday, she sat alone at the kitchen table drinking tea while Nathan slept upstairs. And eventually a very small question emerged. Nathan's project schedule from Tuesday had shown him working remotely from home. But according to his explanation, he had been in the Cascades. Rachel stared into her tea for a long time after realizing that. Most people experience moments in life where instinct briefly surfaces before reason suppresses it. Rachel's instinct surfaced quietly. She did not confront Nathan. She did not accuse him. She simply held the inconsistency in her mind for several days, turning it carefully like an object under light. On Sunday morning, Nathan left for a run along the Springwater Corridor Trail. Rachel opened the laptop, and for the first time in 17 years of marriage, she started checking. Not because she believed her husband was leading another life. No human mind leaps naturally toward something that extreme. She expected to find a scheduling mistake, a forgotten work change, an ordinary explanation. Instead, she found the first visible thread attached to the entire hidden structure. Rachel started with the joint banking account because it felt practical, concrete. She wanted confirmation Nathan had stopped for gas near the Cascades that Tuesday. What she found instead was a fuel charge in Hillsborough. Tuesday, August 17th. She stared at the transaction for nearly a full minute. Then she checked previous months. More Hillsborough charges appeared. A hardware store, a grocery chain, a family restaurant. Nothing individually alarming. Only repetition. Then Rachel found the charge that changed the emotional temperature of everything. A children's shoe store. Saturday afternoon in March. Rachel remembered that weekend clearly because Nathan had told her he was spending 2 days in Bend overseeing a project assessment. She sat perfectly still at the kitchen table. A children's shoe store. The detail itself mattered more than the amount. Nathan and Rachel did not have children. Rachel immediately attempted rational explanations. Maybe a gift. Maybe Ellen's daughter. Maybe work-related. She gave every possibility room to exist honestly because part of her still wanted reality to remain recognizable. But once the mind notices a pattern, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. Rachel opened a browser window, typed the street name into Google Maps. Orenco Station, quiet residential neighborhood, tree-lined streets, craftsman homes, playgrounds. She entered Street View and moved slowly down the road. Halfway through the block, she stopped. Nathan's Subaru sat in the driveway of a 3-bedroom craftsman house beneath a basketball hoop. The older Subaru. The one supposedly used for work travel. Rachel zoomed in, stared, zoomed out, looked again. The car remained exactly where it was, parked casually in front of a house she had never seen before, 40 minutes from the home they shared. The emotional experience of realizing something impossible may actually be true is difficult to describe. The brain resists it. Reality splits temporarily into two competing versions. One version says this cannot mean what it appears to mean. The other begins assembling connections faster than emotion can process them. Rachel closed the laptop slowly, put on her coat, picked up her keys, and drove west toward Hillsborough. It was a cool Sunday morning in late August when Rachel parked 3 houses down from the craftsman home in Orenco station. The neighborhood looked almost painfully ordinary. Children's bicycles, fresh mulch around flower beds, wind moving softly through trees lining the sidewalks. Nothing about the street suggested revelation. Rachel sat in the driver's seat with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, while her pulse moved steadily against the base of her throat. She told herself there could still be an explanation, a colleague, a rental arrangement, a project contact. The human mind protects itself from catastrophic understanding until it no longer can. 8 minutes later, the front door opened. Nathan stepped outside wearing jeans and an old gray t-shirt Rachel had bought him years earlier. He stretched casually, ran one hand through his hair, walked around the side of the house, and rolled out a push mower. The sight itself was devastating precisely because of how normal it looked. Nathan appeared relaxed, comfortable, at home. He started mowing the lawn with the easy rhythm of a man participating in an ordinary Sunday routine he had repeated many times before. Then the front door opened again. A girl around 12 years old stepped onto the porch carrying a book. She sat on the front steps without looking toward the street. Rachel stopped breathing for a moment. The child had Nathan's jaw. Not resemblance, inheritance. The precise geometry of his face reflected perfectly in hers. Nathan called something toward the porch. The girl answered casually without lifting her eyes from the book. The ease between them communicated something more horrifying than evidence of an affair. It communicated history, routine, years, a life already deeply lived. A bicycle leaned beside the porch railing. Purple helmet hanging from the handlebars. Garden beds recently watered. Shoes beside the doorway. Rachel realized with total clarity that she was not witnessing a hidden romance. She was witnessing domestic permanence. Nathan had not secretly visited another woman. He had built another home. And the most painful part was understanding how complete his presence appeared within it. Nothing about his body language suggested guilt or improvisation. This was where he belonged on Sunday mornings. Rachel sat in the car and felt reality rearrange itself internally. Not explosively, quietly, like walls shifting position inside a familiar house. For 17 years, Nathan had divided himself between two lives and somehow convinced both women they possessed all of him. Rachel did not cry, did not confront him, did not step out of the car. She watched until the full shape of the truth settled heavily enough to carry. Then she started the engine and drove home. 15 minutes before Nathan returned smiling slightly, grass stains on his jeans, asking whether she wanted coffee. Rachel looked at her husband standing in their Richmond kitchen and understood that for 17 years she had been living inside half a reality. And 40 minutes west of Portland, the other half had a basketball hoop, a purple helmet, and a daughter with Nathan's jaw. Rachel gave herself exactly 1 week before making any decision. That choice mattered, because rage creates movement quickly, but clarity creates movement accurately. And Rachel understood instinctively that once she confronted Nathan, the structure of his deception would begin changing immediately. Accounts would move, stories would adjust, explanations would appear. 17 years of compartmentalization would activate in self-defense. So instead of reacting, she started documenting. The librarian in her took over. Every evening after Nathan went upstairs, Rachel sat quietly at the kitchen table with legal pads and financial records spread beneath the warm light above the sink. She pulled 5 years of account statements, credit card records, mortgage documents, and insurance payments. At first, the information looked chaotic. Then patterns emerged. Hillsborough purchases repeated with startling consistency. Hardware stores, school supply shops, gas stations, grocery chains. Small, ordinary purchases that meant almost nothing individually but together formed something unmistakably domestic. Rachel discovered recurring payments tied to utility accounts she did not recognize, then property tax records, then insurance policies. The deeper she looked, the more she understood that Nathan's second life had not existed in fragments. It had existed administratively, legally, financially, methodically. One evening, she opened Washington County property records and typed the Orenco station address into the search field. Ownership appeared immediately. Nathan Calloway, Diane Mercer. Purchased in 2009. Rachel sat motionless in the kitchen for nearly 10 minutes afterward. The silence inside the house felt different now. Artificial, like the set of a play after actors have left the stage. Nathan moved normally through the week, completely unaware that Rachel now understood enough to dismantle everything. He asked about work, made coffee, folded laundry, talked casually about a drainage contract near Eugene. Rachel watched him carefully during those conversations. Not searching for signs anymore, the signs had already become facts. What unsettled her now was how normal he still seemed. Nathan laughed at the right moments, touched her shoulder absent-mindedly while passing through the kitchen, discussed weekend plans. He behaved exactly like a loving husband because in many ways he genuinely had been one. That contradiction became one of the hardest parts for Rachel to emotionally process. Nathan's deception had never depended on cruelty. It depended on division. He had somehow separated himself internally into compartments capable of existing independently. And because each compartment received genuine care and attention, neither woman had noticed the missing half. By Friday evening, Rachel knew Diane's full name, her workplace, her age, and the children's names. Chloe, Owen. Rachel said those names quietly aloud once while standing alone in the kitchen. Nathan's children. A daughter old enough to read silently on porch steps. A son Rachel had not yet seen. The realization landed with a strange emotional complexity. Pain, yes, but also grief for people she had never met. Because somewhere in Hillsborough existed another woman whose reality was about to collapse too. And Rachel understood with complete certainty that Diane Mercer had not known. Nobody could sustain shock that authentic if they were participating knowingly. Rachel saw that immediately, which meant two women had lost 17 years to the same lie, and only one man had known the full truth. On Sunday evening, Rachel drove to her sister Ellen's house in Beaverton carrying a folder thick with printed records. Ellen opened the front door, looked once at Rachel's face, and said immediately, "What happened?" Rachel stepped inside, set the folder on the kitchen table, and began explaining. Every family contains one person who becomes the emotional first responder during a crisis. For Rachel, that person had always been Ellen. Older by 4 years, Ellen possessed the kind of practical steadiness people often mistake for hardness until difficult situations reveal its real purpose. She worked as a nurse practitioner in Beaverton and had spent most of her adult life calmly moving through emergencies while other people panicked. She listened to Rachel for nearly an hour without interrupting. Rachel explained everything chronologically. The dead car, the unanswered calls, the Hillsborough charges, the property records, the girl on the porch, the lawnmower. When she finally finished, Ellen sat back slowly in her chair and stared toward the kitchen window for several seconds. Then she said quietly, 17 years? Rachel nodded. Ellen exhaled once through her nose, just the sound a person makes while trying to reorganize reality internally. What do you need? She asked. That question mattered enormously. Not what happened, not are you okay, but what do you need? Rachel looked down at the folder on the table before answering. A divorce attorney, she said. Then after a pause, and help making a phone call. Ellen understood immediately who the call needed to be made to. Neither sister spoke for a moment afterward, because once Diane Mercer learned the truth, nothing would remain containable anymore. Nathan's two worlds would collide completely, and everybody involved would lose the version of reality they had been living inside. Ellen eventually walked to the stove and made tea neither woman really drank. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while Rachel sat staring at the folder of documents spread across the table. One photograph printed from social media showed Diane standing beside Chloe and a younger boy outside the Orenco station house during Halloween. Nathan stood behind them smiling, arm around Diane, the posture of a man completely at home. Rachel looked at the image for a very long time. Not because she hated Diane. The opposite. She kept trying to imagine the emotional violence of discovering that the father of your children had another wife 40 minutes away. And every time she imagined it, compassion arrived before anger. That realization surprised her. Most people assume betrayal naturally produces hatred, but Rachel's strongest emotional response after the initial shock was sorrow. Sorrow for herself, sorrow for Diane, sorrow for Chloe and Owen. Even sorrow, somewhere beneath everything else, for Nathan. Because sustaining deception at that scale for 17 years required something deeply broken long before discovery ever happened. Late that night after Ellen went upstairs, Rachel remained alone at the kitchen table, rereading financial statements, while the refrigerator hummed softly in the background. And eventually one thought settled heavily into place. Nathan's entire life depended on separation. The Portland life and the Hillsborough life could never meet. That separation was the single load-bearing beam holding everything upright. Remove it and the entire structure would collapse. Rachel stared at Diane's phone number written carefully on a yellow legal pad. Then she folded the paper once, placed it inside the folder, and decided she would call Thursday evening. Rachel spent most of Thursday rehearsing sentences that became useless the moment she imagined actually speaking them aloud. How do you explain to another woman that the man sleeping beside her has spent 17 years married to someone else? There is no graceful version of that conversation. No wording capable of softening the reality underneath it. By 7 o'clock that evening, Nathan was attending a work function in downtown Portland. Rachel sat at her kitchen table in Richmond with Ellen across from her holding untouched tea. The yellow legal pad containing Diane's number rested beside Rachel's hand. For several seconds, she simply looked at it. Then she dialed. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. Warm voice, distracted slightly. The voice of someone in the middle of an ordinary evening at home. Rachel suddenly became aware that children were probably somewhere nearby in the background. Television, homework, dinner dishes. Ordinary life. Rachel swallowed once before speaking. My name is Rachel Calloway, she said quietly. I think we need to talk about Nathan. Silence followed immediately. Not confusion, silence. Rachel heard the shift in Diane's breathing before she heard her voice again. Nathan Calloway? Diane asked softly. Yes. Another pause. Long enough Rachel briefly wondered if the call had disconnected. Then Diane said, I'm going to need to sit down. The conversation lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. And during those hours, two women slowly assembled the full map of a deception neither had previously understood completely. Rachel described the Richmond house, the wedding, the 17-year marriage. Diane described Orenco Station, Chloe, Owen, and the years spent waiting for Nathan to feel emotionally ready for formal commitment. At one point Diane laughed once unexpectedly, not because anything was funny, but because shock sometimes escapes through the body in strange ways. He always said paperwork made him anxious, she said. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, because suddenly even Nathan's avoidance of marriage paperwork inside the Hillsborough life acquired horrifying new logic. It had never been emotional hesitation. It had been logistics. Diane had spent 13 years waiting patiently for a commitment Nathan physically could not offer because he had already given it to someone else. Somewhere during the second hour of the call, Rachel said quietly, I want you to know I don't blame you. Diane went silent for several seconds. Then she whispered, I didn't know. I believe you, Rachel answered. And she did, completely. Another long silence passed. Then Diane said something Rachel would remember for years afterward. He made us both believe we were the one he came home to. Toward the end of the call, Diane asked the question both of them had been circling quietly for hours. What do we do now? Rachel looked down at the legal folder in front of her, then answered carefully. I don't want revenge, she said. I just want to stop protecting him from the consequences of what he did. Diane said nothing for several seconds. Then finally, so do I. The strange thing about catastrophic revelations is how ordinary the world continues looking immediately afterward. Traffic still moved through downtown Portland. Coffee shops still opened at 6 in the morning. Rain still collected in gutters. And somewhere inside all that ordinary movement, Nathan Calloway spent the next several days completely unaware that both women now knew everything. Rachel and Diane did not coordinate revenge. That distinction matters. There were no dramatic late-night strategy sessions, no vindictive plotting. What happened next emerged naturally once secrecy disappeared. Nathan's entire life had depended on separation. The moment Rachel and Diane spoke directly to each other, the structural integrity of everything he built began failing simultaneously. Rachel contacted divorce attorney Karen Patel the following Monday morning. Karen practiced family law from a modest office near downtown Portland and had spent nearly 20 years watching marriages collapse under various circumstances. Even she sat silently for several moments after hearing Rachel explain the full situation. Then Karen leaned back in her chair and said, "We're going to need about an hour." Rachel spent most of that meeting discussing logistics, asset structures, property rights, shared accounts, documentation. Karen eventually stopped her gently. "You've done an extraordinary amount of preparation already," she said. Rachel nodded once. Preparation had become the only thing keeping her emotionally upright. Meanwhile, in Hillsborough, Diane met separately with an attorney specializing in child support and cohabitation disputes. The legal situation surrounding long-term unmarried partnerships in Oregon was complicated, but the financial history connecting Nathan to the Orenco station household was extensive enough to create substantial exposure. For 17 years Nathan had maintained control by carefully dividing information. Now information was moving freely between both households, and once that started, consequences accelerated quickly. Rachel filed for divorce first. The paperwork included motions freezing portions of the marital assets pending investigation into financial distributions connected to the Hillsborough household. Nathan received notice Monday afternoon. He called Rachel 7 times over the next 2 hours. She ignored every call. Around 7 that evening, headlights swept across the front windows of the Richmond house. Nathan walked to the front door carrying the exhausted confusion of someone whose reality had shifted faster than his mind could reorganize around it. Rachel opened the door before he knocked. Nathan looked terrible. Not angry, not defensive, simply stunned. "What is happening?" he asked quietly. Rachel looked at him for several seconds before answering. "I know about Diane," she said. Nathan's face changed immediately, just a subtle draining of color. Rachel continued, "I know about Chloe and Owen. I know about the house in Orenco Station. I know about 17 years. Nathan opened his mouth slightly as though preparing an explanation. Rachel stopped him with a small movement of her hand. "You need to leave now," she said. The silence afterward stretched heavily between them. Nathan looked suddenly older standing on the porch beneath the yellow light above the doorway. For the first time since Rachel met him in 2003, he appeared completely uncertain what to do next. He left without arguing. Rachel closed the door gently behind him, then stood motionless in the hallway listening to the sound of his car pulling away from the curb. Not crying, not shaking, just standing inside the strange emptiness that follows irreversible knowledge. Across the city at nearly the same time, Diane Mercer told Nathan he could no longer return to the Orenco station house. And suddenly, after 17 years of belonging fully in 2 places at once, Nathan Calloway had nowhere left to go. People often imagine consequences arriving dramatically, explosions, public humiliation, violent collapse. But the destruction of Nathan Calloway's life happened administratively, quietly, one document at a time. The divorce proceedings moved steadily through the Portland court system during the winter of 2021 into early spring of 2022. Financial disclosures revealed years of overlapping expenditures tied to the Orenco station household. Mortgage payments, insurance, utilities, household maintenance, educational expenses, and children's health care. The legal math became devastating quickly. Resources Nathan had directed toward the second household while legally married to Rachel affected the division of marital assets significantly. At the same time, Diane's legal filings established long-term financial dependency structures connected to Chloe and Owen. Nathan suddenly faced simultaneous obligations from 2 entirely different family systems he had spent 17 years pretending could exist independently forever. The financial burden became crushing. The Richmond house eventually went on the market, and Rachel received a substantial portion of the equity. The Orenco station house followed several months later. Diane sold reluctantly, not because she wanted to preserve anything connected to Nathan, but because the house represented 13 years of her children's lives. Birthday parties, school mornings, family dinners, all suddenly contaminated by the discovery that the foundation underneath their family had never been real in the way they believed. Nathan attempted repeatedly during those months to explain himself. That impulse fascinated Rachel later, because what explanation could possibly exist large enough to contain 17 years? One affair might be impulsive. A year might be weakness. But 17 years required infrastructure, planning, maintenance, and a daily recommitment to deception. Nathan sent Rachel long emails describing emotional confusion, fear, compartmentalization, and love. And in some painful way, Rachel believed portions of what he wrote. Nathan had genuinely loved both households. That was part of the horror. He had not been emotionally absent. He had been emotionally divided. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself division was sustainable. The engineering firm Nathan worked for since 2001 eventually learned about the dual households during an enhanced background review tied to a federal infrastructure contract. No official accusation appeared, and no criminal charges existed. Bigamy laws technically did not apply because Nathan never legally married Diane. Still, federal contracts require trust, and trust once damaged rarely recovers fully inside industries built around risk management. Nathan's contract quietly disappeared during renewal discussions in early 2023. No dramatic termination meeting, no public scandal, only absence. The same way structural failure often happens. Gradually, load redistributes, support weakens, and eventually the structure can no longer hold itself upright. By the spring of 2023, Nathan lived alone in a small rented studio apartment in Salem, south of Portland, south of Hillsborough, almost perfectly positioned between the two lives he had lost. Rachel imagined that geography often, simply because it felt symbolically unavoidable. Nathan now existed suspended between two worlds he could no longer enter fully. Chloe stopped answering many of his texts. Owen occasionally asked Diane when his father was coming home. Diane answered as honestly as she could without placing adult emotional burdens onto children. Rachel returned quietly to work at Franklin High School. And somewhere inside all the administrative wreckage left behind by 17 years of deception, everyone involved began the long, difficult process of rebuilding identities separate from Nathan's constructed reality. One of the strangest aspects of surviving betrayal is discovering how much of your identity had quietly organized itself around another person's reliability. Rachel understood that slowly over the months following the divorce. At first, survival looked practical: attorney meetings, housing decisions, financial paperwork. But after administrative survival came emotional reconstruction, and emotional reconstruction is quieter, more exhausting, and harder to explain. Rachel spent much of late 2021 living temporarily in Ellen's guest room in Beaverton, the same room where she slept the night her car broke down on Highway 26. She walked constantly during those months, long silent walks through neighborhoods wet with Oregon rain. She listened to podcasts about history and architecture and memory because information still comforted her the same way it always had. Sometimes she cried unexpectedly in grocery stores. Sometimes entire days passed normally before grief arrived suddenly while folding laundry or pouring coffee. The grief itself surprised her. Not grief for the marriage exactly, but grief for the version of herself who believed she was fully known. Rachel mourned certainty more than companionship. She mourned the quiet confidence of believing her life made sense. Ellen once found Rachel sitting awake at the kitchen table after midnight staring at nothing in particular. "What are you thinking about?" Ellen asked softly. Rachel considered the question, then answered honestly. "I don't know which memories belong to me anymore." That sentence stayed with Ellen for years afterward, because betrayal at that scale does not only damage the present, it reaches backward. It alters old anniversaries, old vacations, old conversations. Suddenly, every memory requires reinterpretation. Where was Nathan really that weekend? Which emergency was true? Which explanation was logistical choreography hiding another household? Rachel eventually realized she could lose herself forever trying to reprocess 17 years minute by minute. So instead, she focused forward. In January of 2022, she returned to Franklin High School. Students drifted back into the library exactly the way they always had. Nervous freshmen, quiet seniors, teenagers searching unconsciously for someplace safe to exist. Rachel understood that need more deeply now. She had spent 17 years unknowingly living inside a performance, inside a partial truth. The library suddenly felt sacred in a way she had never articulated before. a place where people could exist without pretending. That realization changed her, so did graduate school. In the fall of 2022, Rachel enrolled part-time at Portland State University studying information science and archival systems. She found herself unexpectedly alive inside the intellectual challenge. For the first time in years, her future belonged entirely to her. Not to a marriage, not to maintenance, not to someone else's hidden architecture. One evening after class, Rachel sat with Ellen over dinner in Beaverton while rain moved steadily across the windows. "I think I finally feel like myself again," Rachel admitted quietly. Ellen smiled slightly. "No," she said. "You feel like the version of yourself that existed before you spent 17 years adapting to somebody else's lie." Rachel sat silently with that for a long time, because somewhere deep down, she suspected Ellen was right. Diane Mercer rebuilt differently. Rachel moved inward after discovery. Diane moved into motion. Within weeks of forcing Nathan out of the Orenco station house, she reorganized nearly every practical part of her life. School schedules changed, financial accounts changed, and legal paperwork multiplied across the kitchen counter, where Nathan had once sat helping Chloe with homework. What shocked Diane most was not the existence of Rachel. It was the duration. 17 years changed everything. An affair could have been compartmentalized emotionally, but 17 years meant Nathan had watched Chloe grow from infancy while maintaining another marriage the entire time. It meant every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every family photograph existed beside another hidden domestic life, running simultaneously 40 minutes east. That scale of deception forced Diane to reconsider every version of Nathan she thought she understood. She replayed old conversations constantly, the hesitation around marriage, the occasional scheduling conflict, the stretches where work supposedly became overwhelming. Even his consistency looked different now. Nathan had never seemed unreliable because he managed time with military precision. He remembered appointments because forgetting created risk. He maintained emotional attentiveness because distance created suspicion. What once looked like devotion now looked partially operational. That realization damaged Diane more deeply than the cheating itself, because it raised a question she could not answer cleanly. How much of Nathan had been authentic? She wrestled with that for months, eventually arriving at an uncomfortable conclusion. Much of it had been real. Nathan genuinely loved Chloe and Owen, and he genuinely cared for Diane. He had simply decided, somewhere early in the process, that emotional sincerity canceled out dishonesty. That belief allowed him to continue for 17 years. Without it, the psychological strain would have crushed him much earlier. Diane rarely spoke publicly about what happened. People in Orenco station learned fragments eventually because neighborhoods always do, but Diane refused to turn the situation into a spectacle. She protected the children aggressively, especially Chloe, because Chloe understood more than adults initially realized. At 13, she already sensed the emotional gravity surrounding the house. One evening in late 2022, Chloe asked quietly whether her father had another family. Diane sat beside her daughter on the couch for several seconds before answering. "Yes," she said. Chloe stared ahead silently, then asked the question Diane had feared most. "Were we fake?" Diane answered immediately, "No," and she meant it. The lie surrounding their family had been real, but the family itself had not. That distinction mattered. Over time, Diane and Rachel settled into something difficult to categorize. Not friendship exactly, but something quieter. They texted occasionally, checked in after court dates, and exchanged practical information. Once every few months they spoke by phone. Both women understood something unusual connected them permanently. They had occupied opposite sides of the same deception for nearly 2 decades. Nobody else could fully understand that experience, and strangely, that understanding created a form of peace between them. Not closeness, but recognition. Nathan Calloway spent most of 2023 in a studio apartment in Salem furnished almost entirely with temporary things. A fold-out table, a second-hand couch, and minimal kitchenware. The apartment looked like somebody passing through rather than somebody living. That detail reflected the state of his life accurately. For 17 years Nathan existed at the center of 2 complete domestic systems. Now he belonged nowhere fully. People often expect men like Nathan to reveal themselves as narcissists after discovery. Explosive, cruel, manipulative, but Nathan mostly seemed exhausted. The collapse forced him into direct contact with realities he had spent years carefully separating. Financial obligations arrived simultaneously, professional consequences accumulated, silence from Chloe became increasingly frequent, and Rachel never responded to his messages. Diane communicated only through attorneys unless the children required something specific. For the first time in 17 years, Nathan had no system left to manage, only consequences. He wrote Rachel twice, one handwritten letter and one email. Neither attempted to justify what happened fully because even Nathan understood justification had become impossible. Instead, the messages circled around confusion, compartmentalization, fear, and loneliness. Rachel read both carefully, then deleted the email and placed the letter inside a folder with the divorce paperwork. Not out of anger, but for closure. Nathan also attempted rebuilding professionally through small engineering contracts, independent consulting, and short-term municipal assessments. Enough work to survive, but not enough to recover the reputation he once carried. That part affected him deeply. Engineering had always been the cleanest part of Nathan's identity. Predictable systems, clear calculations, stable outcomes. Now even professional life felt unstable. One former colleague met Nathan for coffee in Eugene during late 2023. According to the colleague, Nathan spent most of the conversation talking less about losing Rachel or Diane than about losing structure. That word stood out, structure, because Nathan had spent most of his adult life building systems capable of supporting enormous weight. Bridges, roads, drainage infrastructure, schedules, and lies. Eventually, every unsupported structure fails. Nathan understood that better than most people, which may explain why, after discovery, he stopped fighting reality surprisingly quickly. He attended court dates, signed documents, accepted judgments, and paid obligations, almost as though some part of him understood collapse had become mathematically unavoidable long before Rachel's car ever died beside Highway 26. There is something important about this story that gets lost if people reduce it to cheating, because Nathan Calloway did not simply betray two women. He altered reality around them. That is what sustained deception actually does. It forces other people to build emotional lives around false information. Rachel made decisions for 17 years using incomplete truth. So did Diane. Neither woman consented to the actual structure they were living inside. That is why discovery felt disorienting even beyond heartbreak. Both women had to reconstruct memory itself. Rachel once described it to Ellen as learning that half the map of her adult life had been drawn incorrectly. That description stayed accurate long after the legal process ended. And yet, something unexpected happened once the truth became fully visible. Both women slowly became more themselves. Rachel returned to graduate school. Diane rebuilt a quieter but more stable home life for Chloe and Owen. Neither woman remained trapped inside Nathan's deception once secrecy disappeared. Nathan, meanwhile, remained emotionally suspended inside the ruins of both lives. That imbalance matters because people often assume exposure itself is revenge. It usually is not. Exposure simply removes protection. After that, reality handles the rest. Rachel understood this instinctively from the beginning, which is why she never screamed, never destroyed property, and never publicly humiliated Nathan. She understood something more effective. A structure built on hidden pressure eventually collapses once the pressure becomes visible. Nothing dramatic needs to happen. People simply stop holding it together. That was the real turning point in this story. Not the lawn, not the phone call, not the divorce. The turning point happened the moment Rachel decided she would no longer carry Nathan's secret for him. Everything after that became gravity. Nathan Calloway still lives in Oregon. Rachel still works in education. Diane still lives west of Portland with Chloe and Owen. Life continued, and that may be the strangest part of all. After 17 years of deception, no dramatic final scene arrived. No arrest, no public scandal, no cinematic ending. Just consequences unfolding slowly across ordinary lives. Rachel eventually moved into a smaller townhouse in southeast Portland, not far from Mount Tabor Park. Books filled the shelves quickly, and routine returned gradually. She still drives Highway 26 occasionally. The first few times felt surreal. Now it mostly feels like a road. That change mattered. Healing often arrives quietly enough that people miss it while it is happening. Diane's children grew older. Owen eventually resumed speaking regularly with Nathan. Chloe took longer, as trust broken during adolescence tends to scar deeply. Nathan continues working smaller engineering jobs throughout Oregon. People who know fragments of the story sometimes ask the wrong question afterward. How did he keep two lives hidden for 17 years? But the more important question may be this: what kind of emotional compartment inside a person allows them to wake up every morning beside one reality while protecting another completely different one 40 minutes away? That answer probably died long before the marriages did. Here is what keeps returning to me about Rachel specifically. She discovered the full destruction of her reality sitting in a parked car on a quiet suburban street watching her husband mow grass. And instead of collapsing immediately, she became careful, measured, and intentional. She understood the difference between reaction and response, and that difference changed everything afterward. Nathan did not lose his life because Rachel sought revenge. He lost it because secrecy stopped existing. The moment Rachel called Diane, the load-bearing wall holding 17 years of deception upright disappeared. The structure failed exactly the way overloaded structures always fail. Not because somebody attacked them, but because eventually they cannot support their own weight. And maybe that is the real warning inside this story. Not that betrayal exists, everybody already knows betrayal exists, but the warning is that people can survive inside false realities for years when trust prevents them from looking closely. Until one small inconsistency, one missed phone call, one street name, or one gas station charge changes everything. So here is the question this story leaves behind. Rachel lost a marriage she believed was whole. Diane lost a future she spent 13 years waiting for. Who carried the heavier loss? And is there even a meaningful way to measure something like that? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone else who would understand it. This has been Wounds and Warnings. Every betrayal has a story. Every story has a reckoning.